Hello and welcome back to another video for AP Psych. This is still part of Unit 5, Cognition. This is the last lesson. It's on language as it relates to thinking. And I know I thought this last video was going to be shorter, and then I recorded it and saw it was 21 minutes, but this one will definitely be shorter. Promise that. So a couple of topics we're going to look at here are mostly related to language, structure of language, organism language in general, theories of language, and my favorite, the Whorf hypothesis. So check it out. Here's a couple questions to be thinking about over the course of this video. What is communication? What is speech? And what is language? Um, we have lots of ways of communicating language that don't involve actually speaking or saying words. There's body language, of course. Somebody waves to you and you associate that with friendliness and kindness. And there's really a million examples, but I'm not going to explain them. A couple of interesting facts about the English language in general. This is really more for personal enjoyment, sharing some of these with my students. Usually they get a kick out of some of them, but I'm not going to read these. Obviously, if you're watching this, you could probably hit pause and read. And here's a couple more facts for you. Again, there are some neat ones about English language, but not going to be explaining them. So let's start with the structure of language. One of the takeaways you definitely need to know about is the difference between a phoneme and a morpheme. It's very easy. Phonemes, think like phonetics, phoning someone, you're talking. Uh, it's sound, smallest particles of sound. In our language, there are about 40 sounds that you can make. There are many more phonemes than 40, of course, but English utilizes about 40 different sounds. So it's the smallest distinctive sound unit. If you were to use your name phonetically, you could think about the phonemes in your name. It's not always letters. Sometimes it is a letter. But for example, like a C sometimes could make a C as in cat. So the K. And if you want to talk about how many phonemes are even in cat, that's probably a better example. So we have cat, k, 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 ah, ah, t, t, t. That would be caught. So that's not even right. But cat, k, a, t, k, k, a, t. Three sounds. So three phonemes in cat. Morphemes is the smallest units of meaning. So this is where you have an understanding with prefixes and suffixes, and morphemes generally are broken down into something called bound morphemes and free morphemes. And sadly, we're not really looking at those. It'd be better if we could look at a paper I would give you in class and practice some examples, but we're not going to do that. So basically, a free morpheme is a word that could stand on its own, and a bound morpheme is a word that cannot. So it's got basically two parts at least that combine to make a word that's understood. We've also got semantics and syntax. These are just for language and understanding. Human beings acquire language pretty rapidly. Once you start using language, you'll see as you go through some of the stages on the next slide, in particular, what's taken place. So what I've highlighted here are some language milestones. And what are you doing over the course of the age 1 month to 6 years of age? And so initially, the first thing you do is you mimic sounds of your environment. You're imitating those sounds that you've heard. Then you get to about 6 months to the next year and a half or so, so 6 months to 18 months, and you're babbling, you're making noises. You're not necessarily making words, but you are making repetitive noises and beginning the foundations of language. By the time you get to about a year or so, you start using individual words. So you're referring to objects. There's a big focus here on nouns in particular. As you start getting exposed to stuff, you begin to acquire an understanding of what those things are. So it could be pronouns as well, referring to a person around you. From about this point and for the next 6 months or so, you are in the one-word sentence stage. Unfortunately, here you start making some overextensions, which is when you learn a word and then try to apply that word to a lot of stuff that is not actually that word. So, for example, you learn the word ball in interacting with the ball, and you're like, "Oh, I've got this round object. This is my ball." But if you find an orange or a watermelon and you're like, "Oh, ball," well, you know, No, but yeah, the idea is conveyed. You think it's round like a ball, so you call it a ball. So that's an overextension. When you get to about a year and a half to 2 years of age, now you start having a massive vocab increase thanks to what's called fast mapping. And so, it's flying around in here. Fast mapping is when you have one individual exposure and you begin to process immediately what those things are. And so, typically, again, with nouns, think about all the acquisition you have for objects that you get exposed to one time. That's where you see a vocabulary spurt with fast mapping. At 2 years of age, you also start your telegraphic speech and your two-word sentences, which basically means if we go back to saying ball, maybe if you want someone to pass you the ball or you want a toy, instead of saying, hey, give me the toy or please give me the toy, you just say, give ball, give toy. You're still pretty much conveying what you meant there. You're just in a situation where you're only using two words. And so the idea is at least still understood. When you get to about two and a half, a little bit later, now you're approaching the three sentence stage. So you start having over regularization errors. And this is when you might use the improper grammatical tense. You might say the ball goed away instead of the ball goes away, or the doll goed away. The doll went away. You are basically just making some present, past, future tense errors. The best age for kids, in my opinion, is a little bit older, 6 years, because now they start to understand a little bit of irony, a little bit of sarcasm, a little bit of what's called metalinguistic awareness, which is the idea that you can now reflect on language. So I can say something to you as a 6 year old, which I don't really interact with 6 year olds, but if I did, you could say, what am I saying versus what do I actually mean? And they might start to actually understand these things and find some humor in that. So, kind of good stuff. Another topic is bilingualism. Um, Biggest takeaway for bilingualism is that some people who are bilingual not only speak a second language, or if you're multilingual and you speak more than two languages, even better. The only disadvantage that's really been found is here. There's a processing speed delay in a verbal fluency, which can be slower. But this is because you're literally alternating between two languages. And I'm not talking like, oh, you take high school Spanish, but you're not really learning it in the way that you should be because of a lack of commitment. Learning foreign languages is usually difficult as you get older because the lack of commitment is not there. No one watching this video who speaks just one language like me is able to remember a time where you went through all those language processing milestones. You don't remember learning the word ball or doll or goat away or goes away. You don't learn that stuff and then remember it because it happens at such an early age. But if I was to now study a foreign language at 31 years old, I'm going to go through those early moments and I'm going to remember them. And so this is what makes a lot of language immersion schools real successful is that kids at an early age actually alternate between their languages and they learn in both languages at the same time. And it helps promote their own verbal fluency. Now, as they get older, the disadvantage is that because they can speak two languages and they may dream in multiple languages or more, depending on how many they actually know, the disadvantage is that their processing speed individually and verbal fluency could be slower. But if you were to combine both languages' abilities, they would vastly be superior to someone who's monolinguistic or only speaking one language. There's a video here. Unfortunately, I'm not going to click on this and play it, but there are people out there who are fluent in many, many languages, and they're called polyglots, sometimes also called a hyperpolyglot. And these people have a real passion for language and learning languages, and as a result, basically make it their life mission to communicate with lots of people. It does help if you live in an area like New York or some other melting pot big city where you can have a lot of resources and a lot of practice and interaction with people who speak different languages. If you're in a small town, okay, that was weird. Not sure why that happened. Sorry about that. Okay, we got animals and language. You can basically read this. But bonobo pygmy chimps have often been extremely intelligent with regards to language. So a famous animal researcher with language, Sue Savage Rumball, has worked a lot with animals, but of course you can't click these links, so there's no point in me rambling about those. Um, we have two theories of language. One of them is from B.F. Skinner. You may remember him from the last unit. His theory is that we develop language out of nurture, so reinforcing and imitation sounds, conditioning in our environment, and this is why we acquire and use language. On the other end of this, we have a nativist, which is arguing for nature. This is Noam Chomsky. He believes that human beings are biologically determined to communicate and to desire language acquisition in the same way that birds have wings and they're biologically determined to fly. And so humans would be innately equipped somewhere within us, not sure where, but somewhere in there, with a LAD or a language acquisition device. And this is going to allow us to begin communication. There's also a interactionist theory which combines both nature and nurture of language. And finally, again, I told you this was a much shorter video. The last idea is culture and language and its impact. And so we have a theory called the theory of linguistic relativity, named after also Benjamin Whorf. So the alternate name is the Benjamin Whorf hypothesis, or just the Whorf hypothesis. And the idea here is that one's language determines the nature of one's thought. So it's no surprise here in English that we don't have a lot of words to talk about snow. We don't really think about snow in a lot of ways. But in the Eskimo or in the Inuit language, there are many, many words for snow. They have hundreds of words to describe snow because culturally it's a lot more important to them. It's a lot more relevant. Their language has evolved around how they would think about snow. Another example is the Hopi people or Hopi people in their past tense. So they actually don't have any language or any words that utilize past tense. So the way that they would even describe something in the past is going to have to look very different than the way that, say, I would describe something that I have witnessed or participated in earlier today. And so that is the end of Unit 5 for us on cognition. Again, hopefully you found this video helpful in explaining some of the ideas in the textbook. And as always, stay safe.